key question, I think, for churches, not just our own church in the diocese, but churches nationally, how do we invest in the future whilst avoiding the mistakes of the past? Voltaire famously said, "One day everything will be well. That is our hope. Everything's fine today. That is our illusion." Voltaire, of course, knew absolutely nothing about organisational psychology, and certainly nothing what organisational psychologists call status quo bias. That is, that individually and corporately we incline to make choices for the status quo, and that even when we can see some positive advantage in making some changes. A very good example of that is that though it's clear that regularly changing your credit card suppliers, your bank accounts, your utility suppliers would give you some kind of financial advantage, not many of us actually make the switch. That's what status quo bias is. There might be an advantage in changing things, but actually by default we like to stick with what is. It seems, according to the EPIC study originally undertaken in 1988 by William Samuelson and Richard Zuckhausen, that people have some kind of irrational bias to and faith in the way things are. Well, you all don't need me to tell you that we in the Church of England get this. Indeed, we've become champions of the status quo in many ways, and in some ways this is perfectly understandable. There is a right kind of conservatism in the church. As that little ceremony to license our two colleagues earlier reminded us, we have a tradition and a message to hand on. But again, as an introduction to the Declaration of Assent, which I read reminds us, we proclaim this afresh in each generation. What does that look like? This is far from easy. How do we connect with modern culture without trashing the tradition that we've received? What is sadly very clear is that the Church of England is just not connecting with many of the subcultures around us at this present time. It's a pretty obvious thing to me as somebody who goes around churches a lot that too many of our churches lack the diversity of the context in which they are set. We are called to be a church for the nation. The critical question for us then is, how do we reconnect? Our conversations in recent times have led us to the belief that we need to rediscover the Church of England as a missionary movement. That is to say, we have to work out how we are to set about the challenging task of the re-evangelization of our diocese. But the secularization of our society, profound differences within the church which could divide it, aging and declining congregations, a shortfall in clergy numbers going forward, financial challenges, can all easily set us off course from our basic calling. The temptation, and I'm at the age where I really feel this myself, is to let the waves of cultural and societal change wash against the decreasing flood defences of the church, and just hope that something, somehow, sometime, will turn back the tide. We know only too well that Jesus assured us that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. But was a heavily institutional, now elderly church what he had in mind when he said that? Let me be clear, addressing this challenge of re-evangelization is primarily the local church's call and responsibility. Ordained and lay disciples following the call to follow Jesus and to make him known, connecting with God so that others may be connected with him and the world transformed. I think to myself, the real question for me as Bishop of this diocese is how might my spiritual leadership help inspire and equip ordained and lay disciples across this diocese to fulfill that calling. The question for us as a synod, a new synod, is how might the diocese, that strange mix of church as organisation and the church as a connected body, foster that connectedness and growth across the whole diocese for the long term. This is a new synod, and before I depress you further by seeking to define further a little of the reality around us, I want you to understand that you all have a part, indeed a responsibility, to play in shaping this diocese for the future. This is the forum in which we invite you to represent the views of the wider church, the whole church, in our debates together. In recent years, we've sought to reshape the synod to be more about engagement with these key issues, with consultation and with feedback. Over the past 2 years, the previous synod, which is some of you, engaged in conversations about the shape of the new strategy to help us fulfill our call. A number of things emerged. One, we should be confident and renew our commitment to the growth program, to discipleship, to mission, and evangelism. 2, we've come a long way, but not far enough. We must change, but build on and learn from the past. 3, in the context of scarce resources, we must find a way to be both fair in the way we provide ministry across the diocese and smart about how we invest for growth. And finally, we have to invest somehow in the future. I've already spoken about our call as Christians and local churches to be a missionary movement. As a church nationally, discipleship and evangelism are now at the forefront of the reform and renewal program. Unsurprisingly, and I hope reassuringly, in this diocese, whole life discipleship, which we have articulated through the growth program, and evangelism have been top of our agenda for some time. This sounds great, simple and uncontroversial, but is deeply challenging for all of us. Our commitment to prayer, self-sacrifice and reliance on God's strength will need to find new levels, I believe. Truth be told, and I think we can momentarily purr about this, the challenges that the Archbishop and National Church are now raising to critical status are ones that we have recognised have been addressing for some time as a diocese. It's interesting to me that I sometimes say to my colleagues, we wrote the song, it's now other people are singing it better than we do. The reducing supply of clergy, retirements outnumbering new ordinations, is something we have substantial experience of. 60% of our beneficiaries have experienced a change in leadership between 2010 and 2015. In 1 year, 10% of our incumbent clergy retired. We try to address this creatively through offering change management support in vacancies, an approach other dioceses have now adopted, and who knows, maybe doing it better than we did. We have also had success in nurturing new vocations. We have made tough decisions as a result of increased financial pressures and decisions of parishes to reduce their giving to the wider diocese to support ministry. We have done what we can to drive down central costs, but like our parochial infrastructure, we can only cut so far if we are to maintain our infrastructure and meet the basic requirements of organisational life in the 21st century responsibly. As I say, we've been early adopters on these challenges and with relative success. There is much to celebrate and give thanks for, and many of you in this building right now have had a part to play in this, and I thank you for that. Crucially, we have learned from what has worked and what hasn't, and this in itself has contributed to our strategy. But the reality is, we have only been in the foothills of these challenges, and need both to increase our discipline and to make a step change to prepare for the ascent to come. Part of this relates to how we share and allocate ministerial resources. The last synod recognised that it cannot spread the ministerial jam ever more thinly and expect growth. Neither should we sustain situations which, as a result of historical accident, precedent and one-off decisions, rather than strategic intent, are over-deployed or under-deployed in the overall scheme of things. This, I'm sure you would agree, is neither just nor wise stewardship. At the same time, the Synod then saw that it needed to invest for growth in Christian disciples, in new ministers, in financial resources, and in new ways of making Christ known. In developing our strategy, we've sought to find ways of bringing these together. So our deployment strategy will provide a level playing field when it comes to appropriate ministry. But we also need to build now on that playing field. We need to invest for the future. This means we need to focus on connecting with younger people, both in terms of evangelism and in nurturing ministry and leadership. This is the step change. This is where we need to have a focused approach. And this is what the mission area plan and ministry plan seeks to bring together. Let me be clear, having mission areas is not a plan to restructure the diocese. When I was a younger man in the world of business, I remember being reminded that if a company restructured and or put a fountain outside head office, it was the time to get your money out. What these missionaries plan to do is to build on what is part of our heart, that is our parochial structure and life. Their introduction is about exploring how to create the best possible conditions for healthy growth and then sharing that elsewhere. They will also provide an environment for the training of new ministers who will be better prepared for the challenge of reconnecting the Church of England with the various subcultures we need to reach in order that the Church reflects the wider diversity of society. There is a lot of talk at the moment about the impact of amalgamations of parishes. The latest and most credible research has concluded there is no discernible correlation between amalgamating parishes and either growth or decline. What is simply obvious is that putting no growth parishes and benefits together and further withdrawing resources was a strategy probably doomed to failure from the beginning and merely accelerated the endemic decline in such amalgamations. Our strategy seeks not only to avoid this obvious mistake, but learn from other experiences. In developing this approach, we've really tried not only to learn from our past experience, but also to learn from what has and hasn't worked in other dioceses. We've recognized that if we are to develop effective partnerships for mission, we cannot overpromise and underdeliver. The reality is that we do not have the resources or the capacity to make these work immediately across the diocese. And very likely it would be foolish to try. As a result, I think, we will focus on piloting this approach in 2 or 3 areas in the immediate future. We need to focus our effort in order to learn and bring the benefits to the wider diocese in the future. In the meantime, we want to invite all parts of the diocese to consider if, how and when they would want to opt into this approach. Of course, we have had a range of feedback around all this, primarily questions, a lot of affirmation, and of course, some serious concerns. We have tried and are trying to listen to and address this. And I'd like to address 2 concerns at this moment. First, the criticism that this approach is top-down. I just need to say, I think this is wholly unjust and wrong-headed. This approach has come about as a result of wide and lengthy consultation. It has allowed ideas and good practice to emerge, bottom up, to inform strategy. This has inevitably slowed down our decision-making, but we hope for the better. Any plan involves those in leadership coordinating and focusing action and policy, and ultimately decisions about this need to be proposed and made for the benefit of the whole. Second, the concern that this approach is not context sensitive or will reduce support for certain parishes, particularly those currently struggling. Well, by proposing pilots which are marked by characteristics rather than criteria, these areas can develop in ways which are appropriate to their context. This will look different in rurality compared to a city centre or an outer estate, and we can share that learning not only in future mission areas, but also in every parish. The approach really can ensure that the support we offer as a diocese and the best practices that is out there can be shared. Furthermore, we're seeking to level the playing field and guarantee ministerial support for all parishes in a way that is fair. I understand people's concerns. To be perfectly honest, I have my own concerns. I've said before that if I had an anxiety, it would be this: is this plan radical enough? Wherever and however you deploy resources, there is still a financial cost to be borne, and that remains whatever. Can we recover confidence in the generosity of the parishes and beneficiaries of the diocese in meeting costs through the parish share pledge? As the wise man said, time will tell. The one thing I need to say is this, and I've said it many times: doing nothing is really not an option. This not least because when the national church allocates its resources going forward, they will want a level of accountability to reassure themselves that the funds they allocate have been used in a strategic way. If we're to do anything different, we will rely on their financial support. The Church Commissioners and the Archbishop's Council have challenged us to have a strategy that will not perpetuate the status quo, but instead changes the way we approach mission and ministry. Our strategy offers that, and they will only invest their resources in something that does that. They have made it very clear that sponsoring decline is not something that they will continue to do. You would think, wouldn't you, that the Bible, the early church, whatever, might have given us a beautiful theory that we might apply to all this. And if you think this in relation to the first missionary drive of the church, you would, of course, be mistaken. Jesus had told his disciples to go into the world, but the Acts of the Apostles remind us that by the end of chapter 7, that worldwide movement had got rather stuck in Jerusalem. Paul had not yet arrived on the scene, and the church was in grave danger of being subsumed into the temple as a slightly offbeat sect of Judaism. What was it that drove them out of Jerusalem? Was it a rousing speech from a church leader reminding them of their divinical commission? Was it a report from a central church pointing the outcomes of the status quo? Was it some dramatic and prophetic intervention of God? Well, the answer to all these questions is a resounding no. For we read in Acts chapter 8, the first missionary movement of the church was not bound the back of altruism. Chapter 8 and verse 1, on that day a great persecution broke out against the church in Jerusalem, and all except the apostles were scattered throughout Judea and Samaria. In verse 4, those who had been scattered preached the word wherever they went. Adversity shook them out of their complacency. And it may be that the only thing that will shake us out of our tendency to status quo bias will be the reality of adverse climatic conditions, the conditions that we face. Samuel Johnson wrote, "It is within the power of all people to do nothing." I believe we need to wake up and do something. Feedback is important, but feedback born of fear is just fear dressed up in rhetoric, and is very rarely backed up by any better plan. This synod, you, may have the last opportunity for this diocese to make some decisions that really will create the sustainable infrastructure we will require to take us into the future, unless, of course, the Lord returns in the interim, which would make our job a lot simpler. Ultimately, we must recall that this is not just about us, not just about our lobby groups and our campaigns, but about God's big idea, the kingdom of God. I trust, dear friends, that together we can and we will rise to the challenge. Thank you for listening.